Rochelle Wilhite. I'm the designated broker of Best Choice Realty, and tonight we are going to be discussing, in my opinion, probably a very important topic that many of you have experienced or have questions about it. And certainly it's very important that we know what's happening in the rental market, because our friends over in property management land are having quite the struggle in adjusting to the new climate of how we're having to work with investors and work with property management with the moratorium and the changes that they're experiencing over there. So I'm very happy to report we do residential and commercial purchase and sale agreements with a little bit of rent back or conversations, but luckily we're not having to negotiate some very difficult situations like our property managers. So in essence, what tonight we're going to talk about is rent back and early occupancy, but we're going to talk a little bit deeper about the final closing details tonight, go over a couple scenarios, discuss the 65A and 65B, and then wrap it up with a letter that my attorney has provided to me that might help you in advising some of your property owners or investors that have rentals or are needing some insight as to their rights, or even some buyers that could be your future buyers that are needing to know what their rights are in terms of being a tenant for a short term. So we're going to talk a little bit about that at the very end. I'm sure there will be some questions as we go through this. If there is, if you wouldn't mind just go ahead and chatting in the chat window. We'll keep the lines muted so I have enough time to get through everything tonight. And certainly if you have a situation or a scenario that you'd like to bring up or you're maybe struggling with, I know that my managing brokers do know how to handle some of these things. Jerry Kay and I have routed questions between the two of us to help you. So we certainly don't want this to be the end all be all tonight, but just to kind of warm you up to some of the things that are going on in our marketplace. So with that, we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So many of you are getting to, and some of our newer brokers need to understand that towards the end of the contract, there needs to be more communication and more transparency. This example here on the screen is from one of my transaction coordinators who does an excellent job of keeping the communication from the standpoint of emails to my clients. But you also, if you are not using a transaction coordinator, you need to be communicating more by email and also by phone, because what I'm hearing and seeing is a lot of text messages going back and forth. And unfortunately, text messages almost become reactive, where emails or phone conversations really are a proactive conversation, a proactive way of communicating and keeping your buyers or your sellers in line. So this example is to help our buyers have the best experience possible and to cover the final steps. So this is an email that usually is sent when the final signing appointment is scheduled, so that the buyer, especially if they're new to buying a property in Washington State, they understand what escrow will be doing, what releasing to record. We've had some challenges with some of the county recorders recently, and just to understand when the transaction is officially closed. So my word to the wise would be less texting, more emails, more proactive phone calls prior to the signing. And then it will avoid a lot of those extensions or uneasy moving requests or some frustrations that are really bottled up that pretty much tend to explode on the day of closing if you are doing a good job at keeping your clients up to speed with the progress of the transaction. So you may need to, if you are having some uneasy conversations or you're struggling with some of those difficult situations toward the end of the transaction, you may need to go back a half a step and actually look at what happens, what is your communication after the appraisal is done and that lender or those funds are needing to get to escrow. Are you involved? Are you making those attempts, and are you doing text messages, or are you really communicating with your clients about some of the most important parts of the transaction, really the last day or the couple days before? So a lot of you ask me, well, I want to negotiate. I haven't done it in the past. Maybe I want to now that things are starting to be a little bit there's just a bit more inventory in some areas. And so it gives you an opportunity maybe not to negotiate with the seller in terms of like 4 other offers that come in or 10 other offers that come in. Maybe you're just trying to make your offer stand out in amongst maybe a couple offers. And so when we start to see that change, which we are seeing in some areas, we are seeing that sellers are still wanting the ability to do or encourage a rent back. Maybe they need time to find the home that they're buying. And in Washington, you're not able to have a seller contingency. So oftentimes what sellers will do is they'll request in a multiple offer situation for the buyers to allow them to stay in their homes after closing. And so if that is the case and your buyer is willing to allow the seller to stay in their home for a period of time after closing, you would want to use a Form 65B and you would check the box. This is a sample what the contract would look like. And you would check the box other. If not, it would be on closing. So a lot of people say, well, how do you really drag? Do you have to really drag and drop? You do. If the box is checked other and there's a different date that's not the closing date in the other, in the purchase and sale agreement, it does say that the parties will negotiate on a 65A or a 65B, and that is separate from the purchase and sale agreement. So in order, I mean, in this instance, I could have put the date of when we were going to have, occupancy or possession. Instead, I wanted to make sure that the sellers knew when I put this together back in 2018, that the sellers were knowing the terms that the buyers were willing to put together for their 65B ahead of mutual acceptance. So it was a nice creative way of just putting that right in there and then including a 65B, but it technically is a separate contract. It's referenced in the purchase and sale agreement, in the Form 21 and the 28, but it's not, you can't actually type 65B in there. You would actually have to put the date or drag and drop and type it with the typing tool in Authentisign if you're going to do it that way. So you've got to probably get your intermediate or advanced hat on if you want to do it like I wrote there. So 65A is when the buyer wants to occupy before closing. And sometimes that happens where, we get in a situation with lenders kind of dragging their feet, moving is full in swing, and the buyers have maybe released their earnest money to the sellers as like a non-refundable deposit. That has happened, and they just need to have a place to stay before closing. That's when you would use Form 65A. And so in this instance, 65A, the landlord would be the sellers and the tenant would be the buyer. So that's what 65A is. And it's a very simple agreement. If you have a client who is wanting to enter into a 65A or a 65B, and they're wanting to do longer than 30 days, really, we should be advising in fact, Best Choice Realty's policy is to come to Jerry Kay or me and have a conversation, because we may need to advise our client use a different type of rental agreement for those longer term agreements. 30 days seems to be okay for using 65A and 65B. They're called short-term type of agreements. Again, they're not part of the purchase and sale agreement. They're referred to in the purchase and sale agreement, but 65A is to occupy, the buyer to occupy before closing. So we see these oftentimes with moving plans scheduled, and then the seller is willing to allow the buyer to enter the property earlier than closing. So there's instances in here, it talks about utilities, who's responsible for it, making sure that subletting, that they're not allowed to sublet and have another person enter the property. So it does say that we have to give disclosures. So I don't know if some of you guys are doing that, but we got to make sure we're doing the disclosures as well. Let's go to the next slide. 65B is when the seller wants to occupy after closing. That would be, like I said earlier, where the seller is kind of like, I want some more time to get my belongings moved to Texas. I've got a week or two. I don't know if you guys knew this, but the moving trucks are booked going out from Washington to some of the other states. It's crazy. Some people have had to get 2 trucks, 2 smaller trucks, and then fly people in to drive the truck if they're going to be self-moving themselves. It is so busy with people moving in our state that just like sometimes you've heard the rental, like the rental car market is pretty difficult and challenging. Same thing with the moving truck. So you'll want to advise that your buyer or your seller talk about moving probably sooner rather than later, because that's where you can run into problems with the 65B. Disclosure, as you can see on the top here, we took 13 and 14 from the actual 65A and 65B. It says that you have given them the disclosures. The landlord and the tenant have received the law of agency, the lead-based paint, and these various disclosures. And as you guys know, we have the disclosure receipt with our firm, and you can use this simple checkbox to make sure that you are properly delivering disclosures to your buyer, seller, or your tenant. It is required to give tenants and landlords the appropriate disclosures. So our property manager friends out there in the various firms actually have to still give disclosures. They're not exempt from that disclosure law. Let's go to the next slide. So the amendment, Jerry Kay wanted me to remind you all that you should be using Form 68C. Let's say you want to amend, there's changes, maybe the date changes on the 65A or 65B, maybe the seller needs more time, an extra week, and the parties agree to do that. Or maybe they're doing some other type of professional cleaning that the parties agree on, or some sort of different type of key system. That needs to be, it shouldn't be, we're seeing a lot of Form 34s floating around. And so if there is an amendment to the 65A or the 65B, you guys should be using the 68C for the lease rental addendum. So make sure you're using the correct form there. Next one. So let's go through a scenario. I hopefully have enough time to get through a couple scenarios with all of you, because these are real deal. These are the real types of things where the buyer needs to have an early occupancy. So some things to keep in mind. Can we get an official, this is actually an email. Can we get an official word from the seller on the change in the move-in due to the work orders that were delayed? So seller had to do some work to the property, and it looks like it got delayed because the contractor until August 6th. Well, the buyers, like I said earlier, the buyers had their moving trucks scheduled. Internet, they probably talked to Comcast and got a date on the calendar for their internet to be set up because they work out of their home office. They had large dogs that need to be transported and storage and living arrangements that needed to be factored in. So obviously in this email, the buyers were seeking help and trying to understand if the sellers were willing and prepared to assist them. But they're afraid when they move dates around that they're going to incur additional expenses that will cost them more, maybe with the lender charging more if we have to do an extension. So appreciate any help. These are kind of the conversations that we're having as buyer's agents. So the more we can stay involved with our clients, the better in knowing how to properly negotiate the 65A or the 65B. This scenario is another scenario that has happened recently where the buyer is intending to occupy early. And so something to keep in mind when a buyer occupies early, this is what can happen. After moving into their new home on Monday, this was a few Mondays ago, my clients are having some issues. This was an email that was sent from one of our brokers to me. First, the mail key was never obtained. So my clients are having to have a locksmith come out to rekey it. Also today, they are finding out some of the outlets don't work in the home, and they're pretty upset that their inspector did not really find this out, and they're wondering what Best Choice Realty can do about it. So with a scenario like this, there's a lot to unpack here. First off, we have, this is a 65, the buyer is occupying early, 65A. So with the buyer occupying early, they are in a tenant situation where the tenant, the landlord happens to be the seller. So the seller has not transferred the mail because the mail is still with the seller. So that provides a lot of problems when you're talking about landlord tenants, who gets the mail, when can we move the mail? I mean, that's something that you guys probably want to think about and get ahead of if you're trying to understand what is the intent of the parties there. And also about rekeying. So when do you get the keys? The landlord tenant, there's a contract there, but there's also a purchase and sale agreement. And so technically you're in a tenant situation with the buyer occupying early. So they're not really allowed to change the keys. We have to wait. So that would be something you would have to have a conversation with the landlord or the seller to understand how to make sure that there's a locksmith or who's responsible. Is it possible to have a different key? Again, these are things that might need to be amendments to the 65A or 65B and that are not covered. The 65A and 65B literally are not supposed to be long-term rental agreements that discusses some of these issues. And as far as the outlets and not working in the home, if the buyer has conducted an inspection, which they do, I advise that the buyer go back to the inspector and find out from the inspector why the inspector did not catch these outlets that didn't work in the home. If we have not closed and the outlets are not working, that could be seen as an item, electrical not working, furnace is not working. It could be considered a material thing that's not working, a component or function of the property that would allow that seller, who still is the owner or the landlord of the property, would have to come out and deal with that situation before closing or hire somebody to take care of that issue. But you can't negotiate inspection repairs. They may have been able to if they had used a 35R and asked the seller to fix some of those things. Like I said, there's a lot to unpack with this scenario and I don't have a lot of time to go through it. The other scenario that has happened recently as well is you can look at this picture on the left, and the picture on the left is showcasing a walkthrough that was done where the agent took a picture of this other repair. And I don't believe this was a repair on the property that was called out by the inspector. This was called out on a walkthrough. So 3 days before closing, a buyer can conduct a walkthrough per Form 21, Form 28. In the actual purchase and sale agreement, it allows the buyer to conduct a walkthrough to make sure there is nothing, no major systems that are broken or that have, that is not functioning properly. Like for example, the stove, you turn the stove on, it doesn't kick on, or the furnace doesn't kick on. Those would be mechanical components of the property. This is what they're asking. They wanted the riser of, I think, the deck stairs to be corrected before closing. So the email from the buyer's agent to the listing agent said, please do the following and forward your email and seller's response to us by tomorrow. Number one, request seller to repair the stairs on the backyard to the condition that it was shown on the posting. See attached posted condition and what we saw today. So in this case, we can't negotiate repairs at our walkthrough unless that we had done the re-inspection and we had negotiated 35R and asked for repairs to be done. Only then can we negotiate repairs to being done properly per the contract. We can't use the walkthrough as our way to request additional repairs. That's not what that's for. However, in number two, replacing the battery of the thermometer and proving that the heating system is working. When this buyer's agent went to check on the property and the heating system wasn't functioning properly, they turned it on and didn't turn on. That is a concern. And it was so good that this buyer's agent did a walkthrough to ensure that the property was in the condition when they viewed it and identified that the heating system was not working and decided to make sure before their client goes and signs their papers at escrow to ensure that there's proper communication between the listing firm and the buyer's agent firm. So without the above being done, we will have to delay the closing date. If you're getting into a situation, well, can I delay the closing date? You may want to call me or call Jerry Kay to get advice on what we should do with certain circumstances like this. Because once you close escrow, we're not the same. We don't have the same duties as a buyer's agent or a listing agent. So we do need to handle some of these important issues like the heating system not turning on. We need to make sure we communicate that legally and properly, not just a text message that goes to the listing agent saying, hey, did a walkthrough and the heating system is not working. That's considered maybe verbal negotiation. We need to provide a notice and send that over to the other side and make sure that they've been properly notified that we conducted a walkthrough on this certain date, and make sure that the seller understands that they will be replacing the heating system or making sure it's functioning, and make sure that that notification is done so that we ensure that our buyers are getting a house and something doesn't kind of creep up after closing. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the other advisory considerations that I've seen in my career, I'm certainly, if you've been in the business longer than a few years, 5, 10 years, you're probably these, I could think of an example for probably each one of these things where it caused a lot of pain, anxiety, stress, all those words that we don't want to have happen in our business. So some of the things you want to consider if you're trying to think, do I do a 65A? Do I do a 65B? Maybe that's not something that my buyer or my seller wants to stomach. If that's the case, then don't do it. You don't get to put yourself in harm's way, because there are issues that we are hearing about when you do a rental agreement and you've got a seller and buyer maybe that don't see eye to eye, or maybe the condition is not what it needs to be. So, I mean, what if the buyer finds or discovers something they didn't find on the inspection? If you let them go into their property on the 65A and the buyer moves in and they don't like the way that, you know, the heating is coming into the property, or like it doesn't have air conditioning, they can walk away. They might lose their earnest money, but maybe their earnest money is not high enough. So be very careful if you're going to negotiate 65A. If you're a listing agent or representing the seller, you may want to advise that the buyer puts maybe additional funds into as earnest money for that very reason, where the buyer might just change their mind and walk away from their low earnest money amount because they find out that they don't have air conditioning in the property, or it's not suitable, efficient heating. I mean, that kind of stuff happens. It's happened before. What if the buyer's financing fails and they're living in the property? That's happened to me once. And so I always want to make sure that we are far enough with the buyer's financing, and I've spoken with the buyer's lender to make sure if they are doing a 65A and moving into the property early, that we have it far enough through underwriting that we're not going to have those challenges. Again, I can't solve every single situation. Even I had one several years ago where the buyer's financing failed. They moved into the property and they had to basically pay for a mover to come and move all their stuff out, and they had to go back to renting because they bought a motorcycle or something. I can't remember the exact scenario. What if the buyer breaches their purchase and sale agreement, remain living in the home? Then they could potentially be a tenant that's just squatting. So again, that is a concern, and that if your sellers are very concerned about something like that, they may not want to do a 65A. What if the seller never moves out? That's happened. We've actually had a few incidents where the seller could not find another property to move into and claimed that they didn't want to change their mind and didn't want to sell. We've had to get legal involved, and there are legal repercussions when we bring a ready, willing, and able buyer to the table and we execute a purchase and sale agreement with no seller contingency and only a rent back. So basically that 65B runs out of time. They're ugly, ugly situations, and you want to avoid that and avoid legal issues, and make sure that there are moving plans and you have a plan A and a plan B, and the seller understands what they're signing. Handling key exchanges can be very problematic. Warranties, if you're going to do a 65A and 65B, sometimes a lot of you who are doing and negotiating 65A and 65B are doing a really good job. This is a top tip for experienced brokers. They go ahead and pay for a home warranty, a 1-year home warranty that will cover the seller or the buyer for that period of time when it has not closed, and then after closing for the entire year. There are warranties that will protect toilets breaking down, plumbing having failures, roofing leaks, furnaces that go crap, water heaters that burst. Those types of things have happened in these uneasy times when you're negotiating a 65A and 65B. So you may, as a buyer's agent or a listing agent, throw in a home warranty, order a home warranty. Just make sure that before closing that receipt or that warranty gets taken care of by escrow, and that it's fully intact so that you don't have any problems when you close escrow and you've got a tentative or a short-term tenant basically in your property. What if they cause damage or something to the property before vacating? Sometimes that happens. Again, that's why some of the rent 65As or 65Bs have a portion per day, per diem, just to give that landlord or tenant comfort in knowing that if there is some damage that we could fix that prior to the vacating. Like I said, earnest money could be increased. Things like that could be done, non-refundables. I'm seeing some of those happening, but there is a chance that as they're moving stuff out, so you don't have the way to do a walkthrough and be the agent, have those duties as an agent once you close escrow. So if you have a Form 65B and the seller is going to live in the property and say they don't give you the keys for another week, you know, they've damaged, as they moved their couch out, they damaged the flooring. There's nothing we can do as agents to go in and say, you damaged the flooring while you're moving, you need to fix that. It falls to kind of a landlord-tenant situation, which becomes small claims court, which unfortunately we don't get involved in. So there are some worries that if you're dealing with like some higher end, some newer constructions, sensitive situations, where you get kind of that feeling like they don't have a professional mover, they might be moving themselves. There are some considerations before you do a 65A or B when it comes to the damage as things are moving out. If your buyer is very sensitive to that, then you may not want to do a 65A or 65B. What if the seller leaves personal items or furniture or the home dirty? That would be also where I've seen it, buyer's agents or listing agents spending their hard-earned commission and paying for professional cleaners to go in and professionally clean for their clients, because that has happened. I've had to personally load up my trailer and go grab some, this is last July, I had to go do I let one of our Best Choice Realty brokers go. They're no longer working with us because they basically did not handle the sale appropriately. And their seller left a lot of personal property in the property after close of escrow. And the buyer's agent, we wanted to have a good reputation. The buyer's agent was being very, very good and thoughtful. They had performed. Our seller and our listing agent did a horrible job. I had to get involved, load up an entire trailer full of stuff to take to Goodwill of personal furniture and items that were pretty much, you know, not what the buyer was anticipating. So that kind of stuff is very, very gray, and it becomes challenging to deal with when it comes to 65As and 65Bs. Another quick reminder before I let you guys go, when you're negotiating 65A and 65B, you may also want to do a quick check with your title. I love what CW Title does. They actually do what they call a date down. What that means is at any point in time when you go mutual on a contract, they can look up, they can review your title, and they can see what is currently on the title, and if there are any changes that need to be made or, you know, updates. And so with this example here, some of the things, if I was going to negotiate a 65A or 65B, will any of the party be doing a power of attorney? So I know that my sellers here are now out of state. So power of attorney, they're not living in the property. 65A, 65B, I'm going to need to probably make sure that things are taken care of with the power of attorney, and that the proper people have the right to execute at the closing details. So we don't have any last minute hiccups when it comes to the title, things that pop up. So you might want to do another quick check. If you're not using CW Title, you might want to contact your title rep and just say, hey, we're going to be probably putting a 65A in place. Can you just do a double check and make sure nothing has popped up from the seller or some specific liens or anything I need to be aware of before I have my buyer and the seller 65A get instituted? So that would be my quick tip for that. Brad is awesome. And then, as many of you guys have experienced phone calls from some of your investors, I too have had those similar phone calls. And so I had my attorney draft up this letter. You're welcome to have it as well. It kind of explains to my investors about the eviction restrictions and to ensure that we have the proper documentation. So she wrote the email here to me and said the moratorium was set to end June 30th and funds were appropriated. However, the program has not actually been set up yet, and the funds are not yet available. The link summarizes Jay Inslee's proclamation. There's a link for the Inslee Issues Housing Instability Proclamation. And then this link is for the proclamation, which specifically outlines how unpaid rent must be paid and the restrictions on the evictions. So I have that link as well. It is a time where the buying mechanism assumes the program will be paid be put full in place in the fall. But again, some of these things are still in process. So in short, the evictions are not allowed for unpaid rent owed between February 2020 and July 31st, 2021, until after the rent payment assistance program is established in the county of the eviction, and the landlords need to comply with other requirements. They need to know in their various counties or their cities what rules they fall within. For future rent, August through September 2021, tenants are required to pay the rent as it becomes due, but evictions will only be allowed in the counties where the rent payment assistance program has been implemented. So you'll need to kind of keep up to date. If you personally have some investments or you have investors who are looking to you for guidance, you may want to just send them a copy of this letter. It's very likely that there will be new information coming out in the next few weeks. As I get it, I will be sure to send it out to all of you. But it is definitely a very interesting time when it comes to property management, landlord-tenant laws. I don't think we can get a landlord-tenant law instructor for another month or two because they're getting attacked right now from all different types of angles, situations that are interesting legal challenges that we're experiencing right now. Hopefully that was helpful. I talked very fast as usual. But if there are any questions, Shannon, if you want to quickly chat in the window, or if there was something I didn't cover that needs clarity, Jerry K, be sure, or Candace, be sure and let me know if I missed something. Shannon, anything that I didn't cover completely?
No, I think that's great, but I do think it's just worth reiterating that 65Bs and 65As, they are separate from the purchase and sale contract. So once the property has closed and funds have transferred between parties, title has transferred and everything like that, the 65A and the 65B are standalone documents. So make sure that those disclosures have been provided. If it's in the city of Tacoma, city of Seattle, there's additional disclosures that have to be provided to both of the parties. So just make sure that you're sending out all of those disclosures, because it is separate from the purchase and sale contract.
And then the eviction. So yeah, I didn't cover that, Shannon. I'm glad you brought that up. But the eviction, you'll probably want to talk with the city, as far as that goes, on how they're handling evictions going forward. Great. Okay, anything else? Any other questions that we have? Now, I'd step into it a little bit though, you guys. If you're looking at prospecting, this is a huge opportunity to let people know that you handle investments. You do handle properties that are looking there where the investors are looking to sell. Maybe they're changing from one property to another property. There's a lot of movement right now between the cities and between the counties. And even out of state. And so that's an opportunity for you if you are wanting to take advantage of that as a very thoughtful real estate broker. You might want to look at doing some farming or some different types of marketing to attract that kind of client, because they need to sell their properties and they're tired of being a landlord. I've heard that a lot recently. And some of them are looking for ways to maybe get into the marketplace and actually do that in the coming months. So it provides opportunities for buyers as well as sellers in that kind of case. All right, that's all I've got for tonight. Have a great week, you guys. Next week, it will be a good one. We've got a couple really good, I've been updating the calendar so you can take a look at bestchoicerealtyhomes.com, click on resources, and you can see the lineup of the different classes and trainings that we have available. You're starting to see more trainings and more people getting out and coming into the office. So, join us for another webinar or training in the coming weeks. And there's some great learning that we're all taking away from all of that. So have a great week, you guys. We'll talk to you soon.